Hello and welcome. I'm very pleased to have you all here today for first History and Citizenship Education Keynote. I would like to ask you to, if you could all turn off your microphones, that would be very helpful. My name is Roland Bernhard. I'm a history education researcher and lecturer at the universities of Vienna and Salzburg in Austria. And together with Jon Nichol, I initiated the HEIRNET online keynotes. And I'm delighted that today a large number of history educators from many countries around the world are here to participate in today's keynote by Arthur Chapman on the topic of powerful knowledge in history education. What are the HEIRNET Keynote talks? They emerged from the yearly HEIRNET conference, the Conference of the History Educators International Research Network, which had been initiated by Hilary Cooper and Jon Nichol in 2004. Since then, HEIRNET has developed into one of the largest, and I think it's just to say, most important academic conferences of history education researchers worldwide, with participants from all 5 continents. Many impulses and many international cooperation projects originated from HEIRNET, such as also this format. The HEIRNET History and Citizenship Education Keynotes are online talks on history's seminal civilizing role in cultural, moral, social and political education of young citizens. As you may have noticed already, we are recording the keynote talk, and we will post an edited version of each keynote on the HEIRNET website and on the newly established HEIRNET YouTube channel. For this reason, it will not be possible to use the chat during the keynote to ask questions. So we would like to ask you to write down your questions somewhere else. You will then have the opportunity to ask your questions and make comments via chat after the end of the keynote, which will last about 30 minutes. And Arthur Chapman will then answer your comments and your questions. The keynote will then end at 8:30 Central European time, which is 7:30 British time at the latest. After the discussion, we will make a little experiment. We will open breakout sessions. Participants of the annual conference, of the annual HEIRNET conference, have consistently emphasized that HEIRNET brings together people and enables them to talk and enables them to create network and friendships in the international community of history education researchers. COVID threw a spanner in the works in 2020, and the conference will also be held online only in 2021. For this reason, we would like to facilitate virtual and informal meetings after the lecture. So I will generate breakout rooms, and you can then choose which rooms you go to, and you can exchange with colleagues from all over the world in these rooms. So that will be an experiment. They will be open until 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock British time. Today, however, it's my great pleasure to introduce Arthur Chapman from the University College London. Thanks very much, Arthur, for your willingness to give this talk as an inaugural lecture, so to speak. Arthur Chapman is Associate Professor in History Education at the University College London Institute of Education. He was history teacher for 12 years prior to taking a university post in history education, and has worked at the universities of Canberra and Edge Hill, as well as in London. His main research interest is in developing historical thinking, and in particular in young people's understandings of historical argument, of historical explanation, and of conflicts of historical interpretation. He has published many articles and books. Recently, he published open access and edited volume, Knowing History in Schools, Powerful Knowledge and the Powers of Knowledge. The full text is available in the internet. I will post the link into the chat so you can access this book if you like. A key concern of his talk will be the question of knowledge and the senses in which it makes sense to define the purposes of history education around knowledge and knowledge building. The term powerful knowledge is currently on everyone's lips, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, and it was popularized by Michael Young, a colleague of Arthur's at the University of London. In this session, we will reflect together on what powerful knowledge means in history. The lecture will also be interactive, which means that you will also do some work during the lectures. Arthur, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Roland, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Jon and HEIRNET and colleagues, for this opportunity. It's a privilege and a pleasure. And I'm just going to try and share my screen and get going. As Roland said, I'm going to be using some software to enable some interaction. I'm hoping you can now see a Mentimeter presentation. Does that sound right, Roland? Okay, so I don't know if colleagues have used this, but what you do is you go to the website and it's at the top of every slide. And if you enter that code, you'll be able to interact. But I have to say there only are 2 slides with interaction, so it won't be for a while. Okay, as I said, thanks so much, everybody. I'll try and have something useful to say. So where does this presentation and work come from? I just want to talk about the institutional contexts from which it emerges. And there are 3 that I want to talk about. So the first is the research. There are 2 research groups at University College London I'm involved in. One is the Subject Specialism Research Group, the SSRG, and we have a website and a Twitter handle and various activities. And our focus is essentially and centrally on developing subject specialism. And we research that in collaboration with colleagues in other institutions, some of whom are here tonight, I'm delighted to say. So colleagues in Karlstad, in Sweden, and also in Helsinki. But that is one of the contexts for this research. I'm also delighted to say that UCL Press have allowed us to open up an open access book series. And really what I'm doing here is promoting one of the first 2 books in that series. And the series is called Knowledge in the Curriculum. I suppose if you were going to put that in non-English terms, we would say subject didactics. And the first thing to say is that all the books in this series are free to download and open access. The second thing to say, though, is that we really, really want people to write books for us. So if you have a subject didactical book that you'd like to write, please do get in touch. So the other context from which this and here are the first 2 books in the series. And I'm going to be talking around the blue one. Knowing History in Schools, and it's a delight also to see that some of my co-authors are here tonight, so thank you for that, and once again for your contributions, colleagues. Okay, the other context in which this presentation and my work emerges is the Centre for Holocaust Education, which I'm proud and delighted to be a part of, orchestrated by my eminent colleague Professor Stuart Foster, and I know that some of my colleagues from that centre are here also tonight. And I'm going to be talking about the centre's work in one respect, because one of the things the centre does is research knowledge and knowing, also a range of other things, of course. Okay, that's a bit about the context from which this emerges. Oh no, a little bit more, sorry. And there are 3 major research reports that my centre has produced. Sorry, 2 have been produced and 1 is currently in production. These are studies of children's knowledge and studies of teachers' aims. And I'll be drawing to some extent on this material later on in my presentation. Specifically also on a couple of books. So there's another open access book which we published last year, and you can see it's free from UCL Press. Please do have a look at that. In this book and in another book, which I'm afraid isn't free, a Routledge book, and in many other places, colleagues from my centre have reflected on what it means to know things and the importance and centrality of knowledge. So I'm just going to acknowledge that what I'm saying here tonight is part of various collaborative projects, and I wouldn't claim in any way personal originality for these things. I'm merely one of the labourers, if you like, in various common enterprises. Okay, let's get down to to the focus. So I'm hoping what I'm going to say has resonance internationally. And I know that some of the debates we've been having in England have also been happening elsewhere. But I am aware, though, nevertheless, that everything we do in life is located, and what I'm doing comes out of an English context. But as I say, I know that there have been similar debates elsewhere. So this phrase, the knowledge turn, is one that's been used with great frequency in England in the last decade, in particular, possibly more so than that since about 2014. And let's get inside that and what it is. So in history in England, there have been a number of factors that have raised concerns or been in the forefront of the minds of people thinking about teaching and learning history. One of them, if you were to go back about 10 years, is what we would call the rise of a kind of competency focused or 21st century focused approach to curriculum. And for many of us in history, we perceive this as a threat, because the central plank of the argument was that subjects are not key. Knowledge is not key, because in the age of Google, all the knowledge in the world is at our fingertips and there is no particular need. Therefore, the argument went, for children to learn very much at all, apart from certain key competencies that would enable them to access and make sense of this rapidly available knowledge online. Now, about 10 years ago, I think in England, that was our real worry. Well, no, it's more than 10 years ago now, more like 2008, 2009. That's what we were worried about, really, is people saying that all this history, all this geography, all these other subjects, really, we don't need them. What we need is information literacy, and that's really it. More recently, another thing which many of us have found concerning, though some people have found it very inspiring, it has to be said, is the rise of a focus on what I'm going to call cultural literacy. This is the notion that a really important function of education and the curriculum is to equip children with not specialized knowledge, general knowledge of dominant discourses and common reference points. And the argument goes something like this: it's really important, if you want to succeed and get on in life, not to have these general skills, these competencies, but to be able to talk the talk of the powerful and influential, to have cultural literacy, so that in the conversation of the influential and the powerful groups, you can participate, so that you can access university, get qualifications and become successful in life. And you might think, what's wrong with that? And I'll try and explain what I think is wrong with it. And what traditionally I think I would have stood behind is something more like this, which is in the middle. And actually in about 2007, one issue of Teaching History, which you can see in the middle there, a journal at the time I edited with other colleagues, focused on making the case for neither the generic skills nor the information-based approach to curriculum, but a discipline-focused approach, which we understood very much in the kind of language that I think many colleagues around the world would use. So in Canada, I think people would be talking about historical thinking and probably mean the same thing that we meant when we talked about disciplined approaches or historical reasoning. And I know also that maybe some of the competencies people might want to talk about in Germany would also be the same kind of thing. But yeah, so traditionally then I would have said, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, what's at stake and what are the discourses, it would have been generic competencies versus information-based approaches versus a disciplinary approach. And I would very much have been arguing for the disciplinary approach. To model this slightly differently, here these things are. So we've got skills and competencies of a generic kind, 21st century skills and competencies that would apply in all subjects, on the one hand, in this diagram. On the other hand, we have a focus on general knowledge. So if you like, content genericism, it's not subject specific, it's not domain specific, it's general. And we've also got this, what I'm now going to call disciplinary formalism, which is an emphasis on the forms of knowledge, and an argument that says what children really need is not generic skills only, not generic information only, but mastery of these important domain-specific ways of knowing. And that's why I'm calling it formalism, because the emphasis is on the forms of knowledge, the ways of knowing. We need, what's developed, I think, recently is something rather different, and we know what to call it. I've come up with a name for it, and I'm going to call it Disciplinary substantialism. So this is, if you like, the opposite of generic content. This is the argument that says what children really, really need is mastery of the outcomes of knowledge disciplines. Children need to know the key facts produced, in the national history or in world history, what the key narratives are. They need to know, if you like, the story maybe of the discipline. And this would apply to physics as much as history. In physics, let's say, children would need to know the outcomes of contemporary physics research, but also to have some understanding of what it means to be a physicist and how physics has developed. But the focus would be on knowing the story of physics, if you like. Now, I think all of these positions are interesting in some ways, but also problematic in others. If you simply focus on generic skills, for example, you don't know anything about the world and how the world works, apart from at a very general level. If you focus only on content of a generic kind, you miss entirely the insights that disciplined modes of thinking can give. But if you simply focus on disciplined modes of thinking, you have nothing to think about or with. And it's important, of course, to have some content to reflect on and to reason about. So I think that what we need to be talking about is, if you like, at the intersection or the points of convergence of all of these. And what that it looks like exactly is something I don't think we necessarily know. So I'm not here to pretend that I know, the answers to the questions I want to ask. What I've been giving there, I suppose, is some story about the evolution of debates in England. And I hope there's something there which has some relevance elsewhere. And it's really been about subject disciplines responding to what were perceived threats to subject disciplines. So if you like, the top and the bottom of this diagram are specialist knowledge. At the bottom, we have ways of knowing. At the top, we have the knowledge outcomes. And the threats have been a focus on generic knowledge, generic information perhaps, or generic skills. Okay, so what we've been doing recently in my research group is having, this is the subject specialism research group, is working in dialogue with Michael Young, who's a sociologist of the curriculum. And it's not, I should emphasize, this is dialogue and discussion rather than dogmatic commitment to or whole-scale adoption of, So these are ideas that we've been thinking with and thinking about and reflecting on the use and limitations of. And I'm going to just try and summarize them for you if you're not familiar with them. But you'll see, I think, as I do summarize them, why they might be appealing to people who are used to thinking about historical thinking or disciplines as ways of knowing. What does Michael Young focus on then? This is the key idea, and it's one that Michael Young has some questions about now because it's been adopted and turned into a slogan. But the idea that he's arguing for is the importance of specialized, discipline-based knowledge. And the first thing that he does is distinguish this from everyday knowledge. And this is the first area where there's some controversy about it. Can you really say that everyday knowledge is not as important as disciplined knowledge? People suggest in discussion with Michael Young, and that's one of the foci for controversy. And I want to say you can say that, but not universally, but in certain contexts and for certain purposes, because as a discipline specialist, I do believe it's worth advocating for discipline knowledge. What is it, though, that differentiates disciplines and specialized forms of knowledge? Michael Young says these next 3 bullet points. It says they have systematicity, they're systematic, they have a conceptual structure, they're specialized, produced through a division of labor among researchers and specialists, and they have a certain kind of objectivity arising from their social nature. All of those things are much debated and argued about as well. I don't have time to deal with all the issues in a short presentation, but I think you can certainly make a case for all of these things. It's more easy in some subjects than others. In physics or maths, one can talk much more rigorously about systematicity, but it's there in history also, one can argue, perhaps through our thinking concepts of the kind that Seixas proposes, or perhaps actually through the structure of the knowledge itself. Some people want to say that time and unfolding over time is key to the systematicity of history. But whichever way you look at it, it's worth asking, how far we can go with that idea. How far can we characterize history as being defined by its systematic conceptual structure? Specialization, I think we'd probably agree, is a key feature of some aspects of historical knowledge production, though not of all. And whether or not we accept the objectivity depends on how much we rely on peer review and academics criticizing each other. But I can certainly see the argument that objectivity, on one understanding of it, is interpersonal. It's to do with the fact that people can challenge you. And in disciplines, at least in theory, the key thing is not authority, it's the quality of your argument, which is assessed by your peers. And I know you'll be assessing the quality of what I've been saying later. Okay, on the basis of this characterization of what disciplines are, Michael Young wants to argue that they produce better knowledge, better truth claims at least, than one might find produced in other ways. Now, that is a controversial claim, because it's the minute you start to establish a kind of hierarchy, people want to question that and ask, you know, are there any things being smuggled in through that? When you talk about hierarchy, are you talking about power rather than truth? And of course, we all know, because we've read Foucault and so on, or Nietzsche, you know, there are issues and debates to be had. But I'm going to try and defend that in a little bit in what I say. And then I also want to think that it's useful to talk about history in terms of empowerment. So the knowledge that history produces, I want to argue, and I'll try and do that, has the capacity to empower pupils or students or all of us, because it allows us to understand some aspects of reality. That's the argument. Okay, I know I'm doing rather a lot at once. On the basis of these concepts, Michael Young and Johann Müller have developed a kind of way of thinking about curriculum change and curriculum development and curriculum rationales, which they call futures. And actually this maps on quite a lot to many of the things I was discussing earlier. Future one, if you like, is the traditional rationale for subjects that says the importance of learning history or whatever is because there is this truth which must be transmitted. It cannot be written down and handed on to the kids. And we know what it is. It's established by tradition. The opposite of that is future two, which, if you like, is genericism about skills. It's 21st century skills. It says that what's really important on the curriculum is what you can do, and what you can do can be analysed in a general way. But what Michael Young is arguing for, and what many of us in history have been arguing for in the UK and elsewhere for some time, is something quite like future three, this notion that there are domain-specific ways of knowledge that generate domain-specific insights into the world, and that's what we should be focusing on. And this is somewhat different from simply saying history is a fixed narrative. It describes history as a way of generating narratives, as a mode of inquiry, and so on. Okay, so what I've tried to do so far is just elaborate the problematic for this book. And I would say that the book is not about dogmatically advocating this. It's about asking, how useful is this to us in history? So just to briefly give you some of the contents. I have an introduction which basically does what I've been doing now, which is elaborate some of these ideas. My colleague Alison Kitson takes them in detail and tries to ask, you know, how does this help us if we're trying to determine the structure of a curriculum? With other colleagues, we look at aspects of learning, for example, the relationship between history aims and broader curriculum aims in chapter 8, or the problems that might arise if you focus only on modes of discipline in chapters 9 and 10, which look at indigenous knowledges and the relationship between disciplines and racism, actually, historically. So the book is not simply saying this is great, believe it, but it nevertheless thinks this is an idea worth exploring. Okay, I'm mindful I've had 17 minutes so far, so I need to speed up. Right, so what I want to do now is to start thinking about the aims of history, make a case for disciplinary aims, and then try and introduce some arguments to explore that. So I'd like to do some interacting now. So if you go to this website, menti.com, you should be able to enter that code and find yourself on a presentation page where what you should find a task, which I'm about to come to. So I don't know if people have seen the location system, What 3 Words? It's an app that will allow you to pinpoint yourself on the planet. Using words, 3 words will give you a grid reference, which someone who wants to rescue you if you're in trouble can use to locate you, even if it's in the middle of nowhere, provided that they've got GPS and so on. So what I'd like to do is to nominate 3 words that you would want to use to locate your own vision of the aims of history on, if you like, the planet of historical knowledge and historical knowing, which of course is a very diverse one with lots of different ways of thinking. So hopefully you should be on that page if you're on the website, and you can do this with a phone, you can do it with your computer, with another screen, you can do it with a iPad. So I'm wondering whether anyone's able to do that. Yes, okay, so if I press S, we should see the first 3 words. Great, okay, we're getting some interesting. So what we can see then is critical thinking is the common feature of 2 people's comments. Rootedness, interesting. So some of these things are, if you like, about specificity, rootedness, identity. Some of them about process, dialogue. Some of them combine process with something to do with values like democracy, understanding. We've got second order concepts there, haven't we? Really interesting. So I'm just going to let that keep bubbling up for a few minutes. We've got 17 responses so far. I think what's really interesting when you get history educators together is what they don't say. And I'm going to explore that further in a minute by showing you the next task is one where you have to rank things in order. And it'll be interesting to see what ends up at the bottom. So at the moment, we've got, you know, understanding, empathy, thinking, knowledge, but critical thinking is the largest thing. Quite a lot of things that would link us to, let's say, historical consciousness. We've got orientation. We've got things that link us, and a narrative as well. We've got things that link us to the second order concepts or the thinking concepts as well, haven't we? But what we don't have front and center is maybe the kind of thing that some politicians might want us to have, like national identity, for example. Next exercise. So thank you so much for that. And here's the next one. What I'd like to do now is to get you to rank some statements. Now there are 10, it's too many, but I'll explain why. So if you go to the next Menti page, you should be able to scroll through these statements. And I'm hoping I didn't make spelling mistakes when I transcribed them hurriedly earlier on, but you have to rank them. And I'll explain why there are 2 in a minute. So this will take a few minutes longer, and I really should be quiet to give you a chance to concentrate. Please rank these statements. Great, so we've got 2 rankings coming through. Now, just to explain while people continue to select them. So these rankings, they're codings that come from a paper that I wrote with my colleagues Alison Kitson and Catherine Byrne that was published in a Spanish journal in 2018. And we asked our student teachers, so these were history graduates, to stipulate what they thought the point of history was. And having done that, in open text answers, we then used thematic coding to try and identify what they thought was important. And so these are the codes that, that reflect the thinking of a group of 40 history graduates, some of whom had MAs, some of whom had PhDs, and who were doing teacher training in about 2010. And I'd be really interested actually to rerun this now and see whether the same things would come out at the top. But I'm not that surprised actually by what we're seeing here. I'm going to take a photograph of it though, just to see if it corresponds to the students rankings, which I'll show you in a minute. So, okay, I think I've done that. I'll just give people a couple more minutes to have a go. But what you can see here is some of the things actually which one would expect, I think, from a group of history educators. So the first one, how could we summarize that? History is important because it's a source of knowledge that enables students to make sense of the world. Now, I would say that is, if you like, a kind of powerful knowledge aim for me, because I think, history is a set of concepts and a set of frameworks, including of knowledge, which enable you to orient in time and also to understand some things. For example, to have some wisdom about the kind of ways in which the world typically works. So, historians hopefully have some knowledge of the world in general, which they can apply perhaps to interpret things they see around them. We've got historical consciousness, I would say, number 2 coming through there. We've got other things coming through as well, such as historical thinking, number 3. So I'm not at all surprised by this. Let me show you what my students said 10 years ago, because the paper was written in 2018, but the data set was older. And it's quite interesting if you look at it, because I think they kind of correspond, don't they, with many of the things that you were choosing. What I'm showing you here, though, is the coding system rather than the fuller sentences. But understanding the present is the kind of thing that you were also largely choosing, I think, as a group. So if you like, that's not surprising. What was interesting about the students, though, was what they were negative about. And of course, this reflects the course they were on. It reflects the particular cohort, and you might find different things. But our students were more negative about than positive about, if you like, national identity and community cohesion, and a lot of the things that were at the forefront of politicians' aims for history, which I think was quite an interesting finding. Okay, where am I going with this? So if we think history is about helping children understand the present, or if we think it's about helping them navigate time and orient in time, what does history have to be in order to enable that? So here are some thoughts about that. I think if it's going to enable children or young people or adults to understand the world around them, it has to have knowledge of the world. But it also has to have knowledge that enables understanding. And this is why, of course, history is quite complex. Here are some of the ways in which we might talk about it. And I should say that all the ways we talk about these things are in a way quite problematic, because they're all analytical and could be improved upon. But we could distinguish between content knowledge. We could talk about conceptual knowledge. We could differentiate that into first and second order, couldn't we? Or into historical thinking, or into other forms of content knowledge. We could talk about procedures. We could talk about generic skills. And this is one of the many ways in which we could talk about these things that I'm sure people are familiar with. This comes from my introductory chapter, and I've just tried to summarize many of the ways we have talked about these things. So this very much draws on the work of the Schools History Project, Peter Lee and so on. The distinction between first order knowledge, or if you like, knowledge of the world or knowledge of the past, and second order knowledge, which is knowledge of the discipline. And many of you will be familiar with these sorts of ideas. Here we have the historical thinking concepts in their English iteration. I know that the version you have in Canada, for example, will be slightly different. Here we have ways of thinking about first order knowledge or knowledge of the past. And of course, many of our traditions of research and history education develop this, don't they? Again, here I'm drawing on Peter Lee again, and the traditions of my institute, I suppose. The distinction between world knowledge and knowledge of the discipline, both of which are necessary for historical understanding on this argument. This is some of the things we might talk about. What we haven't talked about so much, though, particularly in the past, is the actual content itself, if you like, the contents of box number 1, the world knowledge. And what's interesting about the last 10 years is there's been a lot of theorization and development, particularly by teachers, of ways of actually analyzing that. So this is a model by the history teacher Kate Hammond, published in Teaching History in 2014, I think it is, which talks in a rather interesting way about 3 different kinds of knowledge. Sorry, more than 3 different areas of knowledge and 3 different types of knowledge. So for example, just to take the purple section, we have knowledge of a particular topic you might be teaching that could be to do with people's thinking and ideas. So you might be studying, I don't know, an episode, a witch craze, a witch hunt or something like that. And there'll be lots of concepts and content related to that you want children to learn. But also, as you studied more lessons about that period, they would develop concrete knowledge about that period. But if we stopped there, history would be a bit antiquarian. We'd be studying the past, studying topics in the past, and studying periods in the past, but it wouldn't really be about anything else other than the past. And I think what Kate Hammond is arguing is that over time, we want children to build up general knowledge of history, which is, if you like, the kind of wisdom I was talking about earlier. But what I'm trying to say, I think, is, and I say this in my introduction, is in history, we're very used to modeling historical thinking concepts and analysing them. And I've just summarised too quickly, I know, some of our ways of doing that. What we're not so good at and what we haven't done so well, it is argued, and I agree, is theorise how we actually want to build world knowledge of past worlds, which might be applicable to and useful in interpreting the contemporary world, for example, which is what I think this is getting at. Okay, now both of these things are important, and to try and demonstrate that, and I'm keeping an eye on the time as well, I'm mindful that I need to get on with some examples. So here I'm going to, and I hope my colleagues will forgive me if I do this too quickly and if I do it in an overly simple way, I'm going to refer to some of the findings of the research of the Centre for Holocaust Education. Now, the Centre for Holocaust Education is focused on Holocaust education, but it is also focused on knowledge, on what children know and on what teachers think children should know, and on how teachers teach and things like that in the context of the Holocaust. So it's got a particular focus, but what impresses me particularly about it is the scale. So we've been able to do large scale research on what children know and do not know, and what teachers think they should be teaching and their methods and so on in the context of this particular aspect of history. So it has the beauty of allowing us to really zoom in depth on things. Okay, now, often people say, you know, it's a bit problematic talking about best knowledge. I'm going back to Michael Young here. And yes, it is. It's problematic. We don't want to override and to dismiss plural perspectives, plural epistemologies, plural models of how the world works. All of that is true. However, it's also true, and I think topics like the Holocaust really help foreground this, that we are surrounded by rather problematic things which we want children to be able to challenge. For example, distortion and denial. And what we have here is the case of David Irving, who many of you will know in the year 2000, there was a big libel case in England through which he was trying to silence an academic who was talking about Holocaust denial. Helpfully, of course, he failed. But the point is, and it was a point very much made when he was doing that, that through history and through other disciplines, we have, if you like, claims to be able to sort out and challenge untruths and falsities. And this is not something which is just specific, of course, to the Holocaust, as we've seen with the elaboration of conspiracy theories in the contemporary world, which of course do link back to many of the issues in the Holocaust, because, you know, QAnon, for example, has many of the features of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. My point then is that even if we might want to raise some questions about the notion of best knowledge, I think we'd also want to accept that we want children to come out of their education with the ability to sort out lies and distortion, and to be able to do these kinds of things, challenge unwarranted assertions, implausible narratives, narratives which model the world in ways in which we know the world doesn't work, which is what conspiracy theories tend to do by oversimplifying things. Okay, what do we know about children's knowledge in history? What have we found out through the studies that my colleagues have conducted? Much more than I can possibly say now, but let me give you two examples, and I'm mindful I need to move quickly on, so I'll skip that. Okay, when asked in this research of the Centre published in 2016 to describe perpetrators of the Holocaust, just using a word cloud analysis, what you can see here is what the children did, which was to personalize it and to explain the reasons for these events almost entirely on a personal level through the lens of this quote unquote crazy individual, Hitler. One person was able to do it is the kind of thing that comes through very clearly in lots of things children say. What you notice vanishingly smaller is some of the actual specifics. who was it specifically? More children were able to talk in this general personalized way than in any way that reflected nuanced knowledge of these events. Interestingly also, when it came to actually providing a description of the Holocaust, children in the study, regardless of age, tended to do the same thing. We came up with a system, sorry, it wasn't me, it was my colleagues at the centre, I wasn't involved at the time, came up with a rather interesting coding system asking, when talking about the Holocaust and when giving accounts of it, do children demonstrate knowledge of the location where it happened, of the causes, of the scale, how many people were killed, of the time frame over which it happened, and of the perpetrators, the actual methods used, and the victims. And what you can see here is a focus on perpetrators' action and victims, regardless of age group, because these different colours denote different age groups from the beginning of secondary, lower secondary, up through to pre-university level. And this is really interesting, and we could spend ages talking about it, but I'm not going to because we don't have long. But what is very striking about it is the lack of historical context, the lack of historical nuance in many of the things people were saying. And also in many ways, quite troublingly so, because if you ask teachers why they teach about the Holocaust, a very common response is to enable children to challenge racism, to prevent these kinds of things happening again. And if the children aren't able to comment in any detail on why these things happen, in other words, on the causation, then that's really rather interesting, isn't it, for our aims in teaching. So what do we conclude about this and what's revealed from this? I think rather a lot of things which take us back potentially to the range of issues I've just described. So I'm thinking, and I'll come back to it in my conclusion, that what history offers is the capacity to understand the world. Not all of the world, by any means. Historians are cautious. Aspects of the world, however. It enables this by providing children with knowledge of cases in the past. And on the basis of that knowledge, it may well be they are able to make sense of things in the present by analogy. Now, obviously, there are difficulties with that. We need to be careful in drawing analogies. One of the things history does is make us cautious about drawing analogies, make us cautious in the application of our knowledge. Without that knowledge, though, any attempt to apply what we understand is going to be pretty empty, I think. And that's, I think, what's quite interesting about these diagrams, to go back to them. If children come out of school at the age of 18 or 19 with no knowledge, let's say, of why things like the Holocaust they've been studying may have happened, how are they able to apply or use that knowledge in any of the ways in which we might want them to? What these studies also suggest, perhaps, is more than just a lack of content knowledge. When people talk about the world in agent-focused ways, talking about one individual shaping everything, what that shows actually is a lack of understanding of how things happen causally, a poor level, if you like, of historical explanation. So what we can say there is there's a weakness, perhaps, in the second order or the historical thinking dimension of knowledge. What my colleagues have argued really persuasively, and I urge you to read their superb report on this, is that those diagrams actually don't necessarily show limitations of what children know in history so much as the influence of wider cultural representations. Because if you look at how the Holocaust is presented, it tends to be presented as a simple narrative. And to focus on the actual perpetration and the violence and the acts and so on. So maybe actually, when we talk about history and historical education, we can't just focus on developing content knowledge. We can't just focus on historical reasoning. We also have to consider the counter influence of the contemporary culture and ways of knowing that arise there. Also, of course, I think you could argue this, reference to individuals and simplistic models in terms of actors and victims may well actually reflect aspects of the human mind. Primo Levi writes very brilliantly about how one can understand the Holocaust in a subtle way, and what he says is actually applicable to many aspects of historical learning and also many aspects of interpreting the world. But Levi argues that the human mind, if you like, defaults to a narrative model, and in a narrative you have to have simple lines of development. You have, if you like, the victims and the perpetrators, the good people and the bad people. And maybe the simplified ways in which knowledge comes across reflects that, as well as some of these other things. Really importantly, though, I think, until we have developed knowledge of how things happen and how they might be explained, until we have detailed knowledge of particular examples, it's really unlikely that we can apply or transfer or use the things that we learn. And the necessity of focusing on all of those things is kind of what we've got in mind when we're talking about powerful knowledge. Just to go back to where I started, I don't think we can actually claim to know what this means and what it looks like. In history, traditionally, we have opposed this kind of thing and this kind of thing and argued for this, for the importance of the discipline of history as a form of knowledge. I think most history educators are familiar with that and understand it. What we haven't done enough of, though, and if you look at research studies in history, you'll see very few of them, is interrogate this. Interrogate the question, what do kids need to know about? Because if you're going to learn from history, if you're going to apply what you learn in history, there has to be something that you know about. There has to be world knowledge. And I think what many colleagues would want to argue is more attention is needed to that. But what we don't have research studies in a sufficient volume on anyway, I think, is how all of these things interact. And to go back to where I started, I think when we're talking about powerful knowledge, when my colleagues and I in this book have been engaging with the work of Michael Young, it's not because we claim we have the answers, it's because we think there are questions to be asked, and we propose some ways in which that might be done. I'm very mindful I've talked for too long. I'm going to be quiet. Thank you so much for your attention. Roland.
Thanks very much, Arthur, for your presentation. All the participants can now use the chat to make comments and ask questions, and then I will moderate the questions and the comments a bit. Arthur, you talked about how history educators saw a threat in the upcoming competence focus, and how the knowledge turn in the English context was kind of a reaction to this. I found it very interesting. Michael Young, as I understand his work, makes a strong claim that knowledge of the dominant contents of a society makes especially disadvantaged students able to participate in the society and really empowers disadvantaged students. You mentioned that you are in a critical dialogue with Michael Young. So I wonder, how strongly do you agree with Michael Young's position, and where do you see differences to your position? And perhaps also in which way is then your position different to E.D. Hirsch's position on knowledge, which is even stronger in favor of content knowledge?
I think that the way that I would understand the difference between Michael Young and E.D. Hirsch is that the Hirschian position is largely about content knowledge, about generalized knowledge of the world, of the kind that you would need to understand a quality newspaper. You know, so if you like, the cultural literacy argument, which is the Jungian one, sorry, the Hirschian one, the cultural literacy argument is about generic general knowledge, the knowledge that is dominant in the society at a given time. What Michael Young is arguing for, as I see it, is the importance of specialized disciplinary knowledge. And I would agree with the claim, though it does need exploring and moderating and so on, that one of the values of disciplines is they give you the capacity to ask questions, not just to learn other people's answers. You know, so if you learn cultural literacy, you can speak the language, if you like, you have the references for what everyone else is saying. If you master a discipline, you can come up with new answers. Obviously, that's going to be different at school level from university level, but we would want our children, I think, if they have a disciplined mind, to use that phrase of Howard Gardner's, we'd want them to be able to ask critical questions, maybe to reason through some answers for themselves. And that's, I think, what Young is pointing to about the importance of disciplines. But Young is also arguing for the importance of knowing the outcomes of disciplines. And it's much easier to make that sort of case in physics or in chemistry than it is in history, because the content of history is differently structured from things like physics and science and so on. So I'm not sure how much I agree with Young's arguments about the importance of content as he frames it, because I think in history we've been arguing about that for longer. But also there's another thing to say as well, which I think is really important, which is about the diversity of ways of knowing. So I don't think one should allow an emphasis on disciplines to marginalize other forms of knowledge as well. I think we should include them in our study.
Okay, thanks very much. I just want to remind people to tweet about the first keynote using hashtag HEIRNET. So this would be very useful for us to position the HEIRNET keynote even more. So just tweet it using the hashtag HEIRNET. So there are a couple of questions now in the chat from Eleni. Thank you for the illuminating presentation. What powerful knowledge adds to the classic disciplinary knowledge referred to in the past? So what does powerful knowledge add to the classical disciplinary knowledge?
I think there's a lot of alignment with it, and I'm not sure that it is actually divergent. So what's really interesting, I think, if you have a look at Michael Young's contribution to our book, he argues that what he's doing and what he's been advocating and what history educators have been doing aligns very clearly. So I think actually that what Young is saying is parallels very closely, I think, the kinds of arguments that Peter Lee would have made about 10 years ago. So for example, the importance of a focus on disciplined ways of thinking, but also the importance of mastery of bodies of knowledge that enable the world to be understood. So I think that actually powerful knowledge, in a way, is just a redescription of what history educators are good at already, with the caveat, though, that there's an emphasis on the importance of content as well. I think if you look at, in England, certainly, before projects like Usable Historical Pasts, in the middle of the first decade of this century, the focus was much more on thinking concepts only and not on how to develop systematic and organized bodies of knowledge.
Okay, thanks very much. Carla van Boxtel from the University of Amsterdam. You started and ended with situating disciplinary knowledge and ways of knowing next to more generic skills and knowledge. And I would add to that knowledge from other disciplines. Shouldn't we also reflect more on how historical knowledge and ways of knowing relates to these other types of knowledge in order to empower students to better understand the world and act in it?
I think that's unarguable. I agree completely. I mean, this is one of the classic problems with history, isn't it? How do you populate history conceptually? Because you know, we depend so much on concepts from economics, on concepts from social theory, from sociology. So if you were to strip out all the things that, if you like, we borrow from other disciplines, what would be left? And this is a really interesting question. And I think, you know, there are various answers to it, aren't there? I'm thinking, for example, Ari Wilshaw would want to focus on time and temporality as being, if you like, one of the things that defines history. I think Peter Lee has made the same case as well. But yes, I agree completely. I mean, how do we work alongside other social science educators to populate the conceptual vocabularies kids need to make sense of political struggles in the past, economic struggles in the past, social struggles in the past, cultural struggles in the past? Yes, absolutely, Carla, you're entirely right. I agree. We don't have enough research on that, I guess, as well.
Okay, thanks very much. Lucas Pericleos with a critical question. How do we decide what is important for students to know without imposing the knowledge of the powerful?
Yes, well, the answer to that, I think, is we need more research and we need to model that and think about it more. But I think one of the things that stops history being mere imposition is the role of questions and inquiry in history. So it's imposition, I think, if you say to children, here is the answers to all of your questions. Well, no, let me rephrase that. If you say to children, here is the truth, you know, here is the volume you must know. I think what we do in history is we try and enable children to ask questions, but you can't ask questions in a vacuum. You have to have some understanding, don't you, of the shape of the past, of some of the things you might expect to find in the past. So I think there are answers to this. There's research on frameworks and big pictures, which talks about, you know, how you might try and give children, let's say, some chronological framework. That's, if you like, the transmission component of some teaching. But you'd also want to give them the capacity to ask questions about the contents of that framework, which is why it becomes more open-ended and why it becomes more liberating and rather just an imposition. I know, though, that you could object to that in two ways. You could say the questions impose an agenda. How do you make sure your questions are not structuring things overly much. We certainly need to reflect on that. And I think an important question which history education has not properly answered yet, and which we need to consider, is how do the assumptions of historical thinking relate to, conflict with other modes of reasoning about the world. So, you know, it would be naive to think that historical modes of thinking associated with the discipline are the only ways in which we can think about time, change, life, and so on.
Thanks very much. There's a question of a future keynote speaker at the HEIRNET online keynote, Andreas Körber, with a German perspective, and I want to ask his question. I would also like to question the idea of the best knowledge within a discipline as being the central tool for all. I would suggest that what disciplines also need to do is enable students in diverse societies to go to know and understand each other's perspectives also. So it may be not to create cohesion, but to enable to create cohesion as opposed to pre-claimed coherence, as Stephanie Ratje puts it.
Yes, that's a very good question. I don't have the answer, but I've got a suggestion. I don't know whether this works or whether Andreas finds it persuasive. But I mean, I think that historical reasoning doesn't necessarily impose a perspective with quite the rigidity that people assume. I think it's possible, within using the tools of historical reasoning, to come up with a diverse range of stances on any number of questions. And I think we can point to the history of historiography to give some substance to that. So, for example, a lot of decolonial historians, there are decolonial historians, for example, operating in the academy, using the tools and protocols of historical reasoning to question and highlight and problematicize colonialism. You know, so I think that it would be wrong to overstate the extent to which a commitment to historical reasoning imposes a perspective. I think it's a framework within which a number of perspectives can exist. But having said that, I recognize it does impose some perspectives. So, for example, almost all historical reasoning or historical thinkers are, if you like, materialist in some way. You know, you don't find in history books, you don't find references to spiritual entities, for example, and you do in many discourses. So it would be false to pretend that history does not impose an ontology. History does not impose certain assumptions. But I think we can get around that, because I recognize that, you know, there are many ways of talking about time, change, and the past. Disciplined historical reasoning is not the only one. I think what we should be doing in history education, but I haven't had time to elaborate this, is introducing children to historical reasoning, but also introducing them to other ways of understanding the past. I think Herman Paul has a very interesting position on this in his book, Key Issues in Historical Thinking, which I think is his course, his undergraduate course from University of Leiden, I think it is. But I could be wrong. It might be Leuven. I apologize to Herman Paul and to Leiden and Leuven for getting that wrong. But there are other ways of relating to the past. And I think in history education, we should study those as well as historical reasoning and understand the forms and limitations of all of them. But I think Andreas has got a very good point, though I don't agree with it entirely. I think historical thinking it enables lots of different perspectives to be developed.
Okay, we're out of time, but I think since your talk was a little longer, we can also have the discussion, let the discussion be a little longer. So I would say like 5 more minutes or 7 more minutes. And there's a question from Luigi. He says, I think it is now necessary to define the content of this powerful knowledge. Would world history, national history, European history, otherwise the competences will strike back.
I think that's quite right. And I would say, you know, again, the premise of our book was not to say we have the answers. It was to say, I think we know what some of the answers, we know what some of the answers are and what's wrong with them, right? It's not that we know the truth. However, one of my colleagues did try and address this, and Michael Young, by the way, was asked this question, you know, what should the content of the curriculum be? And he says, I can't answer that. I'm a sociologist. And what I'm talking about is knowledge as a social resource and how it's distributed and what knowledge can enable. So Michael Young doesn't pretend to have the answer to that. But it is for history educators to specify it, isn't it, I think? And there have been attempts to do that. So again, I've mentioned earlier this project Usable Historical Pasts, which my colleague Professor Stuart Foster was involved in, Peter Lee was involved in, Dennis Shemmelt in England has done research on this as well. But in the book itself, my colleague Alison Kitson tries to do this. She says, you know, what would empowering knowledge be? What would it need to be about? And also Kenneth Nordgren in his chapter does. So yes, I think that's a really important question. We cannot avoid it. It must be addressed. And some of my colleagues in the book have tried to do that. So I think it's chapter 2 and chapter 8, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Then another question by Marianne. Thanks for your interesting lecture. How do you think about the scenarios of separation and integration of school subjects? What would be your choice for a school curriculum?
Yes, so I mean, I have to confess, when I was a teacher, I taught lots of subjects. So I've got, if you like, a kind of commitment to integration in my own practice. But I mean, that's because my degrees are in sociology, social political theory, and also history. And if you like, I think there's a lot of common ground there. So in a way, in my own teaching, you know, I've taught history, I've taught sociology, I've taught media education, a number of different things, and critical reasoning as well. So there are a number of ways in which one could argue for integration. But my preference is for specialism, and this is for 2 reasons. I think number one, it's really important in terms of teacher identity, I think, in practical terms. So teachers tend to define themselves by their expertise, and it's unusual to find generalist experts. You know, it's a bit of a contradiction in terms. But also, I think the argument for specialism is a powerful one in practical terms for how school administrators tend to behave when you have integration. In England, under the general competency model, over 10 or 12 years ago, I spoke to head teachers who drew the conclusion that what it meant was they didn't have to worry very much about teacher expertise. You know, we could all look it up, and it results in, if you like, it can result, I don't want to claim it always does, in a lack of emphasis on teacher expertise. And I think for quality teaching and for enthusiasm in delivery and for responsiveness in curriculum content, teacher expertise is really important. So I think for practical reasons, but also because of you know, other things as well, theoretical ones, I would want to emphasize separation of subjects rather than integration.
Okay.
In secondary anyway, not necessarily in primary. But
thanks very much for this answer. So one more last question from Carol Capita. Thank you for your illuminating presentation. However, we are asked to help students make sense of within a world 20 years from now, of which we know little. Besides, Luigi is right, the competence-based model, non-subject specific, will strike back due to the accountability that tries to measure something that is not measurable.
So there are 2 issues there. There's one about accountability and one about, am I reading this right? So there's a question there about what children need to know if they're going to be able to make sense of the future. And the second is something I probably have more to say than about the first. I mean, I think the question of curriculum content design is really, really important. And I think we need to try and build into what we're teaching general understandings of various different kinds of things. General understandings, for example, of political crises, of economic crises, of ecological crises. These are the kinds of things we can factor into the content that we include in the curriculum. And I think on the basis of some of those things, children can be enabled to make sense of the kinds of things that are unfolding in the present and have some senses of what the future might hold. I wouldn't want to go too far with that, because I'm very much aware that in climate science and studies of contemporary problems, that one of the key features of the last 50 years or 60 years has been totally unprecedented change, you know, to use a terminology that colleagues writing about the Anthropocene use. And that makes it difficult to make the traditional case one might make for historical content developing wisdom, because if the world is changing in rapidly fundamental and dramatic ways, the extent to which what we know about how it's worked in the past can help us becomes under question. But I would think nevertheless what we can do is try and make sure the history curriculum includes various kinds of history. If it's just traditional political narrative, children have no tools whatsoever to make sense of climate crises. If you factor in environmental history into your curriculum, maybe they have a better sense of literacy about those things. Similarly with social issues, migration issues, if these are part of the curriculum, then we are helping to build a repertoire of understandings which might be some use in the future.
I think that's a nice last sentence. Thanks very much for this fascinating presentation, and also thanks very much for all the participants for the lively discussion. As I said at the beginning, we will go on talking about knowledge on the 7th of April, Linda Lepstick, What's Worth Knowing, Building a Usable Past for Emergent Historical Thinkers. And on the 5th of May, Andreas Körber from the University of Hamburg, Knowledge in a Perspective of Competences of Historical Thinking, a German Perspective. So thanks very much another time. Did you want to add anything?
Just to thank everybody for listening and for your questions, and again to thank you, Roland, and also thank HEIRNET and Jon and so on for inviting me. It's a privilege, and I'm humbled by it. So thank you so much.